We got here a new video from BK. A lot of people asked me to watch this. The shocking facts revealed the iceberg of the secondary attributes. BK always does a great job. Let's see this one.
Welcome to the channel. It's been quite a while since my last video about secondary statistics, and in my humble opinion, a lot, if not everything, has changed since then.
Alright.
That's why in this video, we're going to uncover entirely new facts that will help you understand how important or maybe unimportant certain stats of the game really are.
Okay.
The video will follow the iceberg format, meaning we'll start with the obvious things visible on the surface, and then gradually dive deeper into more hidden and less obvious
So this is a
layers
deep
of
dive,
knowledge.
boys. We're going
diving
deep.
all the way to the bottom, revealing secrets you won't find anywhere else. So make sure to watch the whole video.
Okay. Interesting. I like it.
In this part of the video, we'll focus on common knowledge, mainly what the tool tips present, because most people base their understanding on that. And if your ego is telling you to skip this section, I'd recommend holding off, because I'm going to show you how tool tips can mislead you, even if you're a very experienced player.
Alright.
First and foremost, we need to start with a key stat, combat rating. For PvE, it's essentially a must-have. The penalty for having a lower combat rating than required is massive, making the content nearly unplayable. I don't think this needs much explanation. Everyone has experienced it firsthand.
Yeah, you go to challenge rifts and you get your ass beaten up, like we all been there.
On the other hand, having more combat rating than required for PvE is disproportionately under-rewarded compared to the penalty. That's why I wouldn't focus on anything beyond a 1,000 point surplus.
Yep.
Things get interesting with combat rating in PvP, where the bonus is actually capped at just 10%. Unfortunately, it's not really possible to determine exactly how much of a combat rating difference between you and your opponent is needed to reach that cap, but take a look at the following differences. As you can see, a difference of just under 200 already gives you almost half of the total bonus, specifically around 4%.
So a lot of people think that the combat rating in PvP, it's not, it doesn't add value, but it does. It does, because like it actually, if you are like over the combat rate, your difference between yourself and the other player is like over 1,000. So that's like one of the reasons why the whales also take the advantage, because they go like with these high resonance, high ranking gems and high resonance gems, and they get like a lot of combat rating, because a gem will always give you not only increase the resonance, but also important, they're also gonna increase your combat rating. So the higher rank it is and the higher the quality it is, the higher the combat rating also is gonna give you.
To get the full 10% damage increase,
VK, value
you'll need
king.
almost a 1,000 point gap. So when it comes
Yes,
to
sir.
PvP, it might be worth considering whether investing into more combat rating is actually worth it. I think the rest of the video will help you make that decision. I've also come across a theory that the 10% bonus should actually be doubled. If you're dealing 10% more damage and your opponent is also taking 10% more, in theory, that should result in a 20...
Bro, VK, I say exactly the same thing on my video. I said, if you have higher combat rating, in theory, you're dealing 10% more damage, and if the target is taking 10% more damage, you're actually getting a 20% damage boost. You guys understand? 10% more damage, they take 10% more damage. So it's like 20% gap. Probably the multipliers can be even higher than that.
20% damage difference. However, in my opinion, when we're talking about a difference in combat rating, our potential 10% damage bonus is exactly the same 10% increased damage received by the opponent. So it's essentially just a single 10% bonus, or a penalty in the case of an opponent with a lower combat rating. To illustrate this, let's take a look at one of the tool tips and a small difference in combat rating. For easy calculations, both players have same 10,000 damage. And here's how the damage ratio changes for players with such a difference in combat rating.
Oh, look at that.
It's also worth noting that the bonus and damage reduction do not increase evenly. Both bonuses can be achieved at around a 1,300 combat rating difference. The exact values are shown on screen. And even though these percentages might not seem impressive at first glance, remember they're a multiplier to your total damage, which in the end can make a real difference. The next attributes we'll cover are the first directly opposing pair.
I sincerely think that a lot of people just sleep a lot on combat rating. They are like, oh, I'm always gonna be like below combat rating from whales, but I feel like going a lot of times like with the triple and triple forward, not only you get also the value from the combat rating, but also the extra substats. I feel like the extra substats are also super important, man.
Armor and armor penetration.
A lot of people run like these items, like they have fortitude and willpower, which is nice to boost the secondaries, but then there's only one substat, or like 2 substats maximum. And then you have other guys that are playing with triple and like 4 substats.
And here, based on the tooltips, it's really easy to overestimate both of these stats. Armor penetration is said to increase our critical damage by over 50%, while armor supposedly reduces all incoming damage and also increases the amount of blocked damage. So it's no surprise that a huge part of the player base associates these stats with massive potential for increasing outgoing damage and reducing incoming damage. I used to believe that myself, especially when it came to armor and its damage reduction, but for a slightly different reason. As for armor penetration, I had no doubt from the very beginning that only a small group of whales would actually be able to utilize this attribute effectively. Many players also fall into the trap of tooltips on legendary gems and essences, which clearly state that they reduce the opponent's armor. On one hand, you can't blame those players because the description should be self-explanatory. On the other hand, the actual mechanics behind how this armor reduction works show that it has nothing to do with the armor attribute and
Yeah, it's just a debuff, guys. So it says that it reduced the armor, but it has nothing, there is no connection with the actual armor substat. It just says that this target now is gonna take 28.8% more damage. That's pretty much it. It has nothing to do with the armor itself.
doesn't reduce it at all. So in these example essences, but also in any others, the description should state that a debuff is applied which increases damage or critical hit damage, but definitely not armor, because it has nothing to do with the armor attribute. Although this is...
I feel like it's just a way that it's like Diablo Immortal, no, Diablo franchise and RPGs in a way, they've been saying this is a armor shred. But I feel like in the World of Warcraft, if you reduce the armor of the target, it actually reduces the armor value that they have.
It's only the beginning of the rabbit hole related to armor and armor penetration. We'll return to this later in the video. The next pair of attributes is, of course, potency and resistance. I explained these stats in detail in one of my videos, and although the mechanics haven't changed much, in my opinion their utility has changed significantly. At the beginning of the game, it was indeed reasonable to associate potency with classes that had a significant number of crowd control skills. However, promoting this theory at this stage of the game is completely incorrect. Potency and resistance are opposing stats, and in theory, both are important for every class, which I will, of course, explain in more detail later in the video. And with that piece of information, we'll wrap up the surface level facts so we can dive a bit deeper and
let's go deeper,
things
boys.
that aren't immediately obvious.
So far, like, I feel like every player, even casual players, they know that.
Diving a bit deeper, we need to return to armor penetration, a stat practically loved by everyone. And here I'd like to draw your attention to the first line of the tooltip, ignores some armor. So to understand what that really means, let's take a look at the description of armor itself. In the first line of the armor description, we learn that armor reduces all incoming damage.
It's like the same video that we watched with the audits. I believe that this first part, this and this, doesn't mean anything. I genuinely believe that this doesn't mean anything. What is really... The only thing it matters is like what it says on the second line. Like when we read here, that this, if you have armor, is going to increase the critical hit damage by 57%, and this one is going to increase the block damage reduction by 90%, up from 50%. So it's going to be like 69%. Nice.
And since armor penetration ignores armor, we can assume that armor penetration increases your damage. In practice, however, this is yet another case where the tooltip is misleading because a general increase or reduction in damage for these attributes doesn't actually exist directly. However, considering that a portion of your attacks will be critical hits and some of incoming damage will be blocked, we can indirectly say that these attributes do affect your damage output and input, just not in the straightforward way the tooltips suggest. So to put it plainly, more armor penetration increases only your critical hit damage. More armor increases only the amount of damage blocked. If you have 0 block chance and 0 critical hit chance, then, with one exception, these attributes give you absolutely nothing.
I see a lot of barbs and crusaders, but especially barbs. They put their armor value like 9,000, especially like big whales. This happens a lot with big whales. And because they think that if you have 8 to 9 or 10,000 armor, it's gonna reduce the damage that you take. But that's not how it works, man. And then they have like 8 or 10% block. That is not gonna do anything. Absolutely nothing to your character. You need to have like the block chance almost capped if you want to take advantage out of the armor stats.
It's also interesting how extremely narrow the range is for this attribute's bonus. If you watch my channel, you'll surely remember the video where I showed detailed charts for potency and resistance.
But that before I move on from that, one thing we cannot forget is that if you have high armor, one of the things whenever there is going to be the difference between your armor pen and his armor, then you're not going to be able to apply the extra critical hit damage, which in a way it is going to be good for you because you're going to take less 57% damage.
Named FewRub attempted to demonstrate certain relationships between armor and armor penetration, as well as their diminishing returns. Especially noteworthy is the last line, which shows the changes in overall damage when increasing armor penetration by 100, 200, and 300 points above the opponent's armor. However, he did not specify for what critical hit chance values these results were calculated. As for the chart itself, similar to my one for potency and resistance, it's a bit outdated, and we need to add roughly 100 points to the old attribute values to achieve a similar percentage bonus. The sweet spot now is roughly 300 to 400 armor penetration over opponent armor, but in general, the user was...
So basically what he's trying to say, if you are above the 300 or 400 armor penetration above his armor, you're gonna get almost 50% of the critical hit damage increase. So that's actually a big boost. After that, even if you have 1,400 or even 2,000 armor penetrations above that, you're gonna hit like this flat. You're gonna hit like to the 57%, which is the maximum that can go.
Definitely on the right track.
So armor only works if you have the block chains. So armor works only in a way for the damage reduction of the block chains. Yes, that's gonna happen. And if you have higher, like I explained, if you have higher armor, then he has the armor penetration, then your enemy is not going to be able to have this critical hit damage by 57%. It's going to be 0. So the damage reduction that he says, reduce the damage that you take, it is in relationship, reduce the damage that you take in relationship of the armored pen, which is this, right? And this is going to be 0. You understand? But if he has more armor penetration than you have armor, then this guy is going to apply more 57% critical hit damage on you. That's pretty much all it states.
As for the chart itself, similar to my one for potency and resistance, at this difficulty level, the required value for each attribute is 3,761. Therefore...
Oh, that's nice. So, so by the way, I think this keeps scaling. So this is one of the problems that I have, and a lot of like new players, they have this big issue. They start the game and their secondary is gonna absolutely suck. For the first months, you're gonna struggle a lot because, you know, there is no catch-up mechanic when it comes to the normal gems. And what happens is like your Paragon is gonna go super fast. Your combat rating, it goes extremely slow, so it's not gonna be able to catch up. But more important, even if you have the combat rating to go to the Inferno 8, most of the times you're not even close to have this kind of substats. And I believe I'm a huge, pro new players and free-to-play players as well. And I believe that in the first like 3 months, you should be able to a level of substats that will allow you to do at least PvE well, right? Because like one of the biggest difference that exists from my account free to play from your that has like, for example, 3 months, mine has 1 year and 4 months, right? So I have 1 year extra on top of you of farming weekly gems and daily gems and never selling the normal gems. So like that, I'm able to always be above the Infernal difficulty requirements, and like that I'm going to be able to output way more damage because I got enough potency to increase my armful durations and I got enough armor penetrations to increase my critical hit damage by a lot.
It's enough for your armor penetration to be about 400 points higher to gain over 40% additional critical damage. At this point, you can completely ignore armor because mobs don't deal critical hits nor block attacks. So investing in armor would potentially only increase your blocked damage value.
Yeah, in general, guys, whenever it comes to the PvE, I always go armor penetration and potency. That's all I care. I keep like usually one slot for armor, so I put all my armor in just one big gem. So for example, like I have rank 8 armor, and then all the other blue ones are just armor penetration, right? That's how I do. I do the same with the potency and resistance. I have a very big, higher rank resistance one, and then the rest is just potency. What are my secondaries? So my secondaries after 1 year and 4 months are these. I never sold any normal gems. I have 5,000 armor penetration. I have almost 4,000 armor, and I have like 4.4 potency, right? Like these substats take a long ass time, man, a long ass time. But have in mind, I always did my weeklies. I always did my dailies. I never missed it for 1 year and 4 months. And above all, I never sell these gems. I look at here, never sell. Not even the red ones. Never sell them.
Point is, if you invest in both armor and armor penetration at the same time, you probably won't reach a sufficient amount of either. And if you focus only on armor...
And, more important as well, I never bought them. My plat always goes to buy legendary gems. Always.
Lose just about a 15 or so percent added to the base 50%, since blocking in this game blocks 50% of the damage, and it guaranteed. For PvE content, this gain is so marginal that it really doesn't make any sense. The game is designed in a way that you need combat rating, not armor. Of course, you won't have 0 armor, it's just to emphasize how useless this stat is in PvE.
Yeah.
Unless you have an extreme amount of block chance, but even then, there's nothing really to tank. And since you don't need armor, you can use all the sockets.
This game is all about one-shotting the mobs. It's not about taking damage from the mobs.
And your set items for sapphires. Over time, the effectiveness of regular gems has significantly decreased compared to items, so Fortitude plus Sapphire should allow you to achieve a sufficient amount of armor penetration required for PvP content.
He's using the Diablo 2 music.
At this stage, you're probably wondering, what about potency and resistance? Can you still get a meaningful bonus if you're a low spender or
potency
free to
is
play?
super important.
And I can tell you right away the principles I applied to armor and armor penetration won't work for potency and resistance. First and foremost, you can't neglect resistance, because mobs use harmful effects that will have a significant impact on you. And contrary to popular opinion, at this stage of the game, literally every class needs potency, which I'll prove to you later in the video. For now though, I'd like you to take another look at my chart. I've marked the sweet spot range for these attributes. Right now, that's a difference of about 600 to 1100 compared to your opponent's values. So the first thing that stands out is that, unlike the previous attributes, potency and resistance work in both directions. You either get a bonus or a penalty if you don't have enough of them. What's more...
So basically, what he's trying to say is like, on the armor, there is no negative side. It's like, or you do 0% critical hit damage, or you go 57% critical hit damage. But on the increase of the potency, if we read here, it says that it's gonna increase the duration of your harmful effects. And if you are below the necessary potency for the difficulty, is gonna say that the duration of your harmful effects are gonna be minus 23%. Or can even go higher, I think. Like, I don't know how high it goes, but it goes, I think it's like 28% if you don't have enough potency. So it gets like very grim, man.
These attributes have opposing diminishing returns. The reward for potency is greater than the penalty, while the penalty for lacking resistance is greater than the reward. Therefore, for players who are lacking in stats but want to be more effective in PvE, my solution is primarily willpower in every item, reaching at least similar resistance to your enemies at the given difficulty level to avoid prolonged harmful effects, and if possible, investing in potency. At this point, I consider this the absolute minimum for you to actually benefit from these stats in PvE. Otherwise,
but bro, like, the thing is like, I've been playing for a year and 4 months, and I'm not even close to 5,000. You guys see the problem here? This is a huge problem. Obviously, the majority of the times, whenever I have a selection, I always pick the armor pen because I think armor pen. These like we're talking about PvE mainly, right? But for PvP, that's where I focus, and I feel like armor penetration, in a way, is slightly more valuable because I think the majority of the time people don't have a lot of resistance in PvP because like most of the time they neglect it. So I feel like my potency it is still like quite okay, but to reach to 5,000. I am so far, man. I am so far from it. Like, I don't think it's gonna happen anytime soon. Probably it's gonna take me like 2 years. Obviously, it's like from a free-to-play experience.
Up in the flattened part of the curve, where whether you have 0 or 2,000 will make virtually no difference. But I guarantee you, it's going to get even more interesting once we dive even deeper.
Okay. Alright, we are the deep end, boys. Deep end.
I mentioned earlier that I have some issue with the armor penetration chart. While it is certainly accurate, in my opinion, it causes quite a lot of fear of missing out when it comes to potential increases in critical damage. A 50% damage bonus really does sound impressive, even by today's standards. But to better visualize how armor penetration works, I created my own chart. First, I'd like to discuss the situation where we have less armor penetration than the opponent's armor. In this case, we will not be penalized with lower critical hit damage, because the minimum value is set at 200%.
Yeah.
So 200%
value, guys.
5,000 less penetration or just 100 less. Critical hit damage will always deal a guaranteed 200% of the normal damage.
Yeah.
Once you start having more penetration, your critical...
So, this is why, guys, more important than the critical hit cap or the critical hit damage, it is having critical hit chance. Crit will always be the king stat because whenever you crit, regardless if you have or not critical hit damage, you will always get 200% damage out of that hit. Like, straight up.
Hits can be boosted by an additional over 50%. However, pay attention how narrow the range is in which you actually receive this bonus. We will return to this topic when discussing PvP. The most effective bonus is within the range of 0 to 500. So if you want your penetration to work well in PvP, I would aim to have about 500 more penetration than your opponent's armor.
Alright.
The question is, how many players can realistically achieve that? I think only a small fraction of those at the very top. Also, take a look at the real proportion of the penetration bonus on my chart. I believe showing you this broader perspective might actually have the opposite effect of the on from original chart or tooltip.
So basically saying that as long as you crit, you get always 200% value, and then the 57%, it is kind of minor compared to the value that you already get.
Also,
but the problem also in PvP is that you don't crit as often as you used to, because like the crit is like quite shorter. You still have the roiling, but probably the roiling is going to be one of the only gems that you're going to use to increase the critical hit chance, because Mother's Lament is not like that crazy.
Keep in mind that the bonus from armor penetration is less than 1/6 of the total possible damage. I'm not saying it's nothing, but is it really worth spending a fortune on sapphires for it? At this point, we shouldn't forget about armor, something I used to strongly prefer. Since penetration directly interacts with the opponent's armor, this chart shows armor values in relation to penetration. So when armor is lower, the amount of damage reduced when blocked always remains at 50%. So in this case as well, it doesn't matter how much less armor you have, the 50% damage reduction on block is a guaranteed value.
Yeah.
And of course, having just 500 less armor than your opponent's penetration automatically makes you take 40% more critical damage, but that results from what I mentioned earlier about penetration properties. However, if we increase our armor beyond the opponent's penetration, we will only take the guaranteed 200% damage when they land a critical hit, and we will reduce more than 50% of the damage when we block. It is simple like that. I used to strongly prefer stacking a large amount of armor and block chance.
So basically, Skaze is saying that, you know, if you're gonna block, you're already gonna get the 50% reduction. So going like super extra, it's only gonna increase like a tiny bit, but it's like, the thing is like, if you have higher armor than the opponent, you're gonna have this increase on the block chance whenever you block, but also you're gonna reduce the 57% damage, right? So like that, it's gonna be much better.
As it was the most effective way to reduce damage in PvP, but there is one major problem. Critical hits cannot be blocked. And since I made that video, we've received gems like Mother's...
This is a huge problem. The crits, if they do a critical hit strike, they cannot block. But the block is very valuable. For example, if you have like poisons on you, or you have like damage over time, or like small normal hits, right? I feel like you can get like a lot of like damage absorption from that.
Roiling consequences. The Banquet of Eyes set, and the essence for critical...
The thing is, like, to make a proper tank, you need to put like your reforge sets as a tank. You need to have your gear as a tank. You need to also put your legendary gems as a tank. And the majority of people, they don't have the diversity on the gems to be like, okay, like majority of people, they just go for the universal setup that's gonna work like very well for PvE, because that's the majority of the times that what they do, and it also will work for PvP. But now imagine like how much gem power, how many copies like you need to have. Okay, I need to have like my PvE, I need to have like my PvP, and then I need to have like this other one, which is like the reforged families for the PvP tank. Then I need to have like I don't have, like, personally, I don't have enough copies or enough legendary gems or enough gem power to build like so many copies. Like I wish that in the future that probably is gonna be my next project. So the first one was I built my universal setup to do damage. Then I built my what I call the cancer set, which is like the ones with like the very disruptive 1 stars, like Faltered Grass, Black Rose, like Crimson. They attack the target, they're gonna immobilize. They are very annoying, right? So my third project is gonna be to start building up my 1 and 2 stars for PvP. I want to be a tanky. I want to try to play a tanky build, but I'm still a bit far away from that.
Hits. What I mean is that the overall level of critical hit chance is drastically increased, and as a result, block efficiency has drastically decreased. And along with that, the armor attribute declined. Not to mention that the effective range for gaining bonuses from armor and armor penetration is so narrow that for about 80% of players, these stats are practically useless. When it comes to the exact value of armor and armor penetration you should use for PvP purposes, it's a very individual matter, and each case needs to be considered separately. However, I can show you a few statistical examples so you can better apply them to your own setup. So if you aspire to be a solid PvP player, in my opinion, you should always try to counter players stronger than yourself. I mean with higher numbers. Against players...
Yeah, I feel like this is the majority of the players, right? They are like here. Here is usually people that played the game or very casually, or they sold the normal gems, or they are even like free-to-play players. That's where they are. Most players are here, especially the ones that they don't mean max, man. Like I listen, I spoke with whales, and like sometimes like people just don't know things, and they don't understand the value that it comes like with these secondaries, right? So they put all that efforts in the legendary gems, they forget completely about these, and they move on with their lives. But then they go into PvP, and they are like, what the hell? Why am I dying versus like a 2000 resonance? Why am I getting like my boot cheeks clapped by a 3000 resonance whenever I have like 9000 resonance? They don't understand. They don't understand because like they are failing here on the secondaries.
With lower stats, you should have no problem handling them. So first and foremost, you need to put in some effort and check what stats your opponents roughly have, and then decide whether to build yours accordingly or not. So let's imagine that on the other side, we have a whale who has roughly 7,000 armor, penetration, and 7,000 armor.
Jesus.
For most people, it's not an extraordinary situation. Fortunately, many whales build their stats evenly. On our side, we have players with the following stats. And now
building it evenly, usually it covers a bigger majority of the players inside the battleground, and instead of going, for example, 10,000 armor and like 10,000 resistance, for example.
Question: whose attributes are the strongest against right-hand side player? The correct answer is nobody. Everyone's are virtually equally ineffective. They all suck. Especially frustrating for the player who has 6,000.
Because they are all below 1,000. So they get no damage increase. They don't get like anything
in these attributes, because it turns out they're taking just as much damage as player number 1. And yes, I know someone will say that a 1,000 difference is already a zone where stats slowly start to give some bonus. But the truth is, it's negligible. And even a difference of 500 less in the case of armor is simply a waste of money. As we know from previous parts of the video, armor penetration critical damage is at least 200%, even in the case of a huge deficit. Therefore, for each of the players, I removed 1000 penetration to increase armor. For the first player, this will absolutely make no difference. If you're a new player, free to play, or simply have heavily neglected your secondary attributes, then your train has already left the station. For these attributes, you should mainly focus on having armor penetration for PvE gameplay. As for the second player, against the whales, this change still won't matter. Both attributes will remain equally ineffective.
So, am I here? Yeah, I'm around here. No, oh, this is armor. Okay, never mind.
However, increasing armor to 5,500 will statistically cause a large portion of players not to deal him increased damage from critical hits. And someone might ask, why not increase penetration at the expense of armor? I believe that in cases of attribute deficits, a defensive stat like armor will prove much more efficient. But of course, that's up to you. And the most interesting
depends on
is the third
play
case,
style,
where penetration remains just as ineffective, but increasing armor equals the opponent's penetration. As a result, the third player completely...
But there's also here another point, which is like, whenever you go into Battlegrounds, like I play at Legend rank, right? So you have like a multitude of players, which is like, you have the 10,000 whale at the top, which probably has like the 7,000, but then you have like the 9,000 whale that probably also has around like the same secondaries. But then the rest of the 6 players, they are, okay, maybe like 6,000, 5,000, and then like you also have the ones in the bottom. So obviously, for example, as myself, I cannot beat the whale, doesn't matter what I do. So I always try to find out, like, and identify inside their team which are the ones that are like, you know, lower resons to mid reson, where I can actually fight and be efficient with it. So those are the ones that I try to pick up the fight, because like you're not gonna be very efficient versus a whale, but you're probably still gonna be very efficient versus someone that is like, you know, just like 2000 resons and maybe doesn't have the stats as well developed as yours.
Gates the critical damage bonus that the whale previously had. So, referring back to the doubts about which attribute to increase, if the third player had chosen to increase penetration by 1000 instead of armor, it would also equal the whale's armor, but that still wouldn't provide any benefit.
Yeah.
Additionally, it's important to remember what was said earlier, that armor and armor penetration only provide an extra bonus on top of the base value. So maybe the community overvalues these attributes too much.
So basically what he's saying, it's a good point. He said, if this guy had 7,000 armor pen, and if he matches with his armor, he's not going to get any benefit at all. However, if his armor matches his armor penetration, he evens out. So this whale is not going to give him 5,000 or the 57,000% more damage. That's a good point.
Additionally, it's important to remember what was said earlier, that armor and armor penetration only provide an extra bonus on top of the base value. So maybe the community overvalues these attributes too much. So if armor and armor penetration aren't as effective as they might seem, then what is? The answer is quite unexpected, but very simple. It is, of course, potency. And here I know how many of you are upset with what I'm saying. After all, you don't use dots, you don't use crowd control. How dare I say something like that? Of course, potency works great on some crowd control effects and to prolonged dots. But there's something else that many people forget about, even though it's hard for me to believe. I've long promoted increasing beneficial effects as one of the best stats in the game, especially with the current legendary gems. Now everyone understands that and recommends prolonging buffs. So why is it that no one seems to notice how insanely powerful it is to extend debuffs as well? Perhaps it's because for the training dummy, it's completely unnecessary, and I've noticed a huge trend that dummy is indicator of a good build. My approach is purely pragmatic. The solution needs to work primarily in actual practice, not just look impressive on a training dummy. But going back to debuffs, remember all the effects from first part of the video, which, according to their tooltip, reduce armor, but in practice are debuffs that increase damage. Over the past year, many such legendary essences have been added for every class, and extending the duration of these effects on your opponent is exactly what your potency does.
But okay, I was hearing before I said anything. I think, like, in general, at least from my perspective, I can see like the value, especially for example on Spectral Glass, if you have it, because like you have that multiplier that comes from the potency. Also, you're gonna have also the misery elixir. You're gonna also add like the 2 pieces barons, and all of a sudden you can actually put like a Spectral Glass almost at the 100% uptime. It's not gonna be a 100% uptime. It's still gonna have like a 1 second, downtime, but it is extremely powerful. But I feel like the thing is, it gotta be always a mix. For example, I am right now at the 5,000 armor pen. I am ready to start putting like my effort. So whenever I'm gonna choose the legend, the normal gems that I'm gonna get, I am starting to shift to potency, because I need to get like this 22% up to 30%, because like that I'll get like such a big benefit out of it. Because right now the reality is like, yeah, I could get here more 3%, from 57, from 54 to 57, but the reality is like I'm already like almost above the cap. So I have like 40% here, I have like 94% here together with this one. So, and then I still have the blood flow. So together with the blood flow, I am reaching the 120, which is the cap of the critical hit chance. And the reality is like there's even other ways that I can keep increasing the critical hit damage, which I am not. I don't have critical hit damage here on my shoulders on purpose, because I removed them to put the critical hit damage, and I also don't have it here on this main hand. So also I don't have like the other lev. So probably I could increase my my critical hit damage even higher. So because of that, I'm shifting from armor penetration to potency, just because I think now at the level that I'm at, my armor penetration is going to be very good for a very long time.
Last year, many such legendary essences have been added for every class, and extending the duration of these effects on your opponent is exactly what your potency does. Even if your build doesn't contain such effects, there's a very good chance you're using Roiling Consequence. Most people focus on the first bonus, which is, of course, great. It gives a huge amount of critical hit chance, and on top of that, you can extend its duration. However, the true power of this gem lies in its second bonus,
on the burning,
because while the first bonus is active, your critical hits reactive, burning effect, making the target even more vulnerable to critical hits. And even though the tooltip shows 3 seconds, in practice when you're constantly attacking the target, it lasts at least 13 seconds, because it's a reactive.
Yeah, because like the last second that it stays on, it's still gonna proc. I noticed one important thing, guys. The blood flow actually stays on the target like 2 or 3 seconds, even longer than the Roiling Consequence. That was very, very impressive to see, man. Very, very impressive. So as long as the target is burning, you actually can get like up to this like 12% critical hit chance. Obviously, these are 5 out of 5 rank 10. Not everyone has this, but it is a crazy stat.
Effect. Something very similar to the third effect of Banquet of Eyes. Of course, we can extend this even further by using, for example, the Baron or Augment set. And of course, potency.
No, Spectral, the Spectral Glass, it is a debuff, not a buff. A buff, it is like Roiling Consequence. A debuff is something that is going to be a harmful effect on the target.
So this gem only allows us to keep the enemy burning for at least 15 seconds. Extending this burn is important because if your character has wind attacks, you'll get an additional 50% damage from Firestorm. And that's just one example.
That's why the Roiling Consequence is the absolutely goat.
Very similar mechanic applies to one of the new gems.
Oh, that it is.
Great gem.
That's what I was talking about.
A cheaper way to increase critical damage than stacking huge amount of armor penetration. There are really many examples like this, but with that being said, I think you already understand how much potency can actually change the game. Especially for you, I've also prepared update version of potency performance chart. And the first thing to note is that the effective range for potency is much wider than the narrow one for armor and penetration. And the ranges where the gains are negligible are still impossible to be capped. Most importantly, potency and resistance, unlike armor and penetration, clearly work in both directions. We get a noticeable
positives
bonus
or
when
negatives.
our attributes are higher than the opponent's, and a clear penalty.
This is such a big problem for, like I said, for new players, and even for myself, man.
When our attributes are lower. The wider effective range also ensures that for most players, getting within the range will be possible, for example, at least to reduce the penalty. But it also has its downsides. So if you're going to buy every citron on the market, hold your horses for a bit. Potency definitely has many beneficial effects for virtually everyone. However, we need to go back to the armor and penetration example, where I explained why increasing penetration is not effective when you don't have attributes as high as your opponents. The wider effective range for potency makes this even harder in this case. Now you probably...
Oh, because if you have lower potency... Okay, so if we have a buff that's gonna be like 10 seconds, and I have lower potency than his resistance, I'm gonna have less 30%, right? So it's gonna be around 60.6%. Then his resistance, it is higher than me, so he's gonna be able to... Let me see. Well, let me read you here the tooltip. Is it, am I seeing this right? The tooltip on the resistance says that the durations against players to a maximum of 30. Okay, so you can I multiply these two? So can I reduce like 30% because of these, and also increase? Oh my god, are we talking about a reduction of like 66%? That'll be insane.
You wonder why I recommend potency then? Well, focusing on potency had a very important purpose. It was meant to make you realize how harmful an opponent with a large...
guys, I know like this is very like super technical, but it's like super important to understand whenever you're trying to build up a good character.
amount of potency can be, which directly shows how important your resistance is.
I want to see if
I've
I
also
was right.
created an updated chart for resistance, but it's best to compare it side by side with potency. In my opinion, for PvP purposes, whether you should invest in potency does not depend on which class you play, but rather on how high you can raise this attribute while also maintaining a high level of resistance. But for the vast majority of players, investing evenly in both attributes will actually result in receiving an unsatisfying bonus from neither. As I mentioned earlier, for PvP, we should always aim at stronger players, so let's focus on the left side of the chart, where our values are negative compared to the opponent. As you can see, in the case of negative values, the penalty for lacking resistance far outweighs the potency reduction.
Oh yeah.
That's why you absolutely cannot afford to have a low resistance value. It's crucial. Even if you have to do it at the cost of drastically lowering your potency, I believe it's worth it, because a lack of potency can be compensated with two pieces of the Baron set. In the case of positive values, the situation reverses, and the benefits of potency become greater. However, in my opinion, you should aim for roughly 1,000 resistance points above the average potency of your opponent to maintain maximum defensive effectiveness. Which of course means that for the vast majority of players, there will no longer be room to have efficient amount of potency at the same time. But it's actually
because it's always a trade-off. That's the problem.
Resistance, not armor, that should be your defensive priority in PvP. It will protect you from crowd control, which has always been obvious, but it will also significantly reduce the damage you take by shortening the duration of debuffs, even though this effect isn't immediately visible and doesn't work directly. It's resistance that, alongside the previously mentioned combat rating and your health from resonance, provides the greatest survivability. But resonance is a topic for a separate video. With all that being said, I hope this video highlighted which attributes are clearly overrated and which ones deserve much more attention, as well as shed some light on the matter for less experienced players. Remember, you all are the biggest support for this channel, and as always, thanks for watching.
This was a absolutely goated video, man. What a great video from VK. Wow, dude. Like, really good video. Go ahead, drop him a like and a sub if you're still not. Absolutely crazy.